Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. It's just gone 1 minute past 4, so I think it's time we make a start. My name is Matt Smallman. I'm the author of Unlock Your Call Center, which is just positioned just here, and the founder of the modern security community. My my work day to day is helping organizations improve the usability, efficiency, and security of their call center security processes. And today we're hosting a session where we're going to talk about the realities of implementing modern voice biometric security solutions. And why do we need to do that? Well, in my conversations with organizations and call center and contact center leaders across the world, it's become really clear to me that that many people's perceptions of this technology may not be up to date with the current best practices. And therefore, I'm delighted to be joined today by by Brett Berenik, who's joining us from Montreal in Canada. Hi, Brett.
Hi, Matt.
Who is the lead for biometrics and security at Microsoft. Well, Nuance was Nuance, and now Nuance, a Microsoft company. So, Brett, why don't you introduce yourself and just tell us quickly how you found yourself in this field to start with?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Matt, for having me on the webinar. I am truly thrilled. And before I introduce myself, I will give a little plug for your book. So I was very thrilled when you published it, and I've made it mandatory reading for any employee that joins the security biometrics team because I just find it's very well written and very comprehensive. So great work, Matt. So I lead the security and biometrics business here at Microsoft, formerly Nuance, part of the AI contact center group. And I've had the pleasure of, directing the product strategy, the R&D strategy, and the go-to-market strategy for the voice biometric product line at Nuance, now Microsoft, for the last 12 years. I'm an expert in the biometric space. This has always been a passion of mine. Started a little over now 20 years ago in this space. And I'm really thrilled by today's topic because I think it is apropos. 20 years ago, this was a science project, and now it's a very mature field. And hopefully we can answer some of the questions that have come through so far. Matt, I know you went out and reached out to the community, and you've received a lot of feedback. So hopefully you can bust some of the myths that still persist in this space.
Thanks, Brett. I think we're just having a bit of trouble with your audio again. So I don't know if anyone on the chat can just let me know whether they're experiencing the same issue as me or not. But we might try and get that fixed. If it might just be my dodgy headset. Brett, just before we jump in, how did you find yourself in this field? Like, were at university, is this the thing I want to do, voice biometrics, or how did you kind of stumble into this occupation?
Yeah, Matt, I love that question because I'm going to provide a response that may surprise some of your audience. My intent when I was studying was actually to join the RCMP.
Hey, Brett. So sorry, your audio is cutting in and out. I don't know if you.
Should I try?
Do you want to? Do you want to leave and come back again, and I'll entertain people whilst you're away, and I'll put a bit of context around today's conversation.
I'll give that a try. All right, thanks, Matt.
So very sorry about that, everyone. Brett will be back in a minute. These things happen when you run live webinars, so apologies for that. Today's discussion, though, is going to be around three big topic areas, and they're the ones that come up every time I talk to call and contact center leaders, and particularly those whose experiences may be rooted maybe in the 10, 15 years ago when this technology first exploded onto the scene. And I was one of those early practitioners. So I may even be partially responsible for setting these expectations and perceptions of how the technology needs to be deployed. And there are three categories that really come up in all of these conversations. And the first is around complexity. This stuff's just really hard to do. And in recent experience suggests that it may not be as hard as people make it out to be. The second is around performance. It's not as good as it needs to be, or to get it good enough just takes too much time and effort, and it extends product and implementation timelines beyond an acceptable level. And the third then is around cost. It's just far too expensive. I need millions of dollars to implement this technology, and it's fine for the big guys, but it's never going to work in my organization. So those are the three topic areas that we're gonna cover in a minute. But I'll just try and get Brett back on the call, and we'll see if we can make this work.
Hey,
Hey,
Matt, is
Brett.
that any better?
You're a lot better there. Yes, I
Okay,
think you were
great.
telling us about your aspirations to be a Mountie. I think I
Yeah,
heard that correctly.
that's right. Yeah, I wanted to be an RCMP officer. For those of you who are not familiar with Canada, it's our version of the FBI. But we do, they do wear these nice uniforms and ride on horses from time to time. And I realized that I could apply both my passion for crime prevention and my passion for technology in a different way. And that's how I ended up in the technology field. So decided to focus on biometrics, and here I am at Microsoft, helping organizations fight fraud and improve authentication.
That's cool. That's great. So glad to have you back, and the audio is a lot better. People are just confirming that online. I think one other before we jump in. What would you say has been your biggest, most greatest professional achievement in this field? What gives you most satisfaction?
Yeah, Matt, and my response, I think, will be very logical with my origin. So whenever I see a customer of ours that is using our technology, identify fraudsters, and then work with law enforcement to identify the individual and ensure their arrest and prosecution, that just gives meaning to what I do. And I think it gives meaning to the entire team that is working on this product. And it motivates us to wake up early in the morning and work long hours and make sure that our customers have the best technology in their hands.
Awesome, that's great. And I won't embarrass you, but a mutual friend of ours, Dan Miller, shared I think a webinar you must have done like 7, 8 years ago with him, which has a much younger looking version of your face on the front page. But I think at that time we were close to 100 million voice prints enrolled, and I think the projection was by 2021 that we'd be looking at close to 500 million. How close are we? Have we exceeded that?
We've definitely exceeded that number, and I can only speak to the data that we have here, at Microsoft. But what we've seen is very large organizations as well as small organizations adopt this technology. And I used to use the term, democratizing the tech. And I feel that over the last couple of years, as the technology has gotten into the cloud and has been accessible to smaller organizations, we've definitely seen increased adoption. It's allowed a lot of consumers across the world to use the technology to authenticate. But sometimes it's also used in the background without them even being aware from a fraud prevention perspective.
Awesome. I think that's great to hear that there are just so many people using the technology, not just for authentication. So we're going to jump into our main topic areas, and we'll try and weave in people's questions as we go. But if you have other questions, you want to throw them in the chat, particularly on the website, I have this up on my screen so I can weave them into the conversation as we go on. So the first area we were going to talk about was complexity, really. And when we talk about all of these subject areas, we're going to kind of look a bit at kind of what was true, what's true now, and what does that really mean for organizations thinking about implementing this technology. And the first is around integration complexity. And I personally, I didn't have any gray hairs before I started thinking about implementing voice biometrics. I think I got too many just now. But I certainly remember a decade or more ago when putting in my first implementation of this, we had to buy extra routers because the routers we had didn't manage port spanning, and we had to reconfigure our entire network just to be able to listen to calls for passive voice biometric authentication. We found some weird oddity where like a third of our calls were routed through a server that happened to sit underneath someone's desk in Jersey for some reason, and a whole bunch of complex, challenging integrations that made testing and delivery really challenging. And I'm just not sure that certainly hasn't been my recent experience. I don't know about you, Brett. What's true today for complexity of integration?
Yeah, and that's one of the surprising things for individuals who are not familiar with the space, is that the most complicated aspect of deploying biometrics in a contact center historically has been how do you get the audio? How do you get the audio from the contact center to the voice biometric solution? And Matt, your experience back in the day is unfortunately indicative of how many organizations had to tap into audio, right? Which was with hardware, right? So it required acquiring new devices, right? Whether it was routers or SBCs, right? Whatever that hardware component was, but you needed to find a way how to send the audio. And then once the audio was sent over, there was a need to actually, integrate to the contact center platform, and that was the second challenge. And so many organizations were several months into the journey of deploying voice biometrics without actually having performed a single biometric transaction, right? And that created a lot of frustration. So the good news is that today that is gone. With contact centers that are in the cloud, so CCaaS solutions, sending audio to a third-party solution, such as a voice biometric platform, is as simple as flagging an API call, right, or initiating an API call. And fortunately, organizations like Microsoft, but also others in this space, have created out-of-the-box integrations to the major CCaaS platforms. And so really that audio, that data is flowing bidirectionally, instantaneously out of the box. So you can start using the solution just with a couple of clicks instead of getting heart palpitations trying to figure out how to acquire and deploy hardware in physical contact center locations, which sometimes can be quite challenging.
And I think it also, just to reiterate that, I think it comes back to your democratization point. Like, finding the audio in the network used to be some sort of black art where only a few of the high wizards of networking were able to identify where it was using packet sniffers and all sorts of stuff to try and figure it out. Whereas today, it's most developers will be able to read the documentations of the API and make it work with a bit of trial and error in a few hours, with very little kind of need for extra support or extra skills and experience beyond what an engineer would normally have. So I think that democratization point's really clear, as well as, like, as you're saying, like, we've been doing this a bit now, so there's not many things we haven't seen yet. So every time I come across a new situation, obviously the solution can get evolved to meet that, but not necessarily. But the problems aren't new. Acquisition of audio, as you say, is pretty much a solved problem now. One of the areas that seems to be less solved, however, is the business processes, and I think for me that's certainly the area where the biggest challenge I see in implementation is like, okay, so we know the underlying technology works, we can get the audio and we can run biometric transactions on it, but figuring out how to fit it in our business processes, our agent desktop, how we manage consent, how we ask consent, how we manage which customers we're going to ask, all of that extra complexity still exists, doesn't it?
It does, but unlike organizations that deployed voice biometrics several years ago, there's a lot of knowledge out there, whether it's with individuals like yourself, Matt, who have that experience and can share it with others, or coming from vendors such as Microsoft that have worked with several customers. There's no need to start from scratch and ask fundamental questions about how to enroll, how to collect consent, because many others have gone through this process and many others have solved this. So, I know back in school it was forbidden to look at somebody else's paper and get heavily inspired from what they're doing. But I think in the business community that we should be doing that. We should look at what our peers have done, and yes, maybe tweak it, maybe augment it, right? Adapt it to how things operate within specific organizations, because full transparency, there are differences, but there's no need to start from scratch. So Matt, I know that you've been very instrumental in helping organizations, right, getting them on the right path. And I think it just makes a ton of sense to tap into that knowledge.
I think that's really, my book's gone out of shot, but there's a starter for 10 in the book. But I think that's absolutely true. I remember gonna pull up a sandbag and listen to a story for a second, but back in 2010 or so, when we first thought about implementing this technology in the UK, we had to engage with regulators. We spent several months doing customer focus groups to figure out whether they would actually use it, what was the right way to ask them, how did they want to how it be approached about the service. And whilst that was really valuable and it did help us kind of implement the technology at that point, it was against a different kind of cultural context, but also an unproven technology. So it was worthwhile at that point. But certainly in my more recent work, whilst we often start with a blank sheet of paper because that's probably the best way to do it for most organizations, actually we do find ourselves coming down to one or two very, very similar patterns. So I would completely reiterate the kind of copy with pride ethos there, that yeah, the patterns exist, and now it's about customizing those patterns rather than starting from scratch. That's a great point. Uh, moving on then, conscious of time, the other area that people often think about is performance. And I think about performance in a couple of different dimensions. So the first area we're going to talk about is kind of core performance of the underlying biometric engine. And I remember it's not my history lessons here, but there was a lot of skepticism originally about this technology. It wasn't good enough. The failure rates were too high. It wasn't accurate enough. It wasn't secure enough. And those, to some extent, were valid maybe a decade ago. And if to get it to a performant level required quite a lot of work, and there was a certain degree of chicken and egg. Like I need to get some audio from my customers in order to figure out what they sound like, so I can be sure the system's secure. But I can't really ask my customers for audio until I've got them something to use. So we used to see quite long periods of friends and family testing or limited pilots where we were capturing audio in order to tune and calibrate the model so we could be confident enough to launch it to the general public. But I just don't see that being the case anymore in the more recent implementations I've worked on. How has the technology improved, Brett?
Yeah. So Matt, the technology has improved in leaps and bounds. When I started studying voice biometrics, the state of the art technology was able to authenticate somebody with free form speech, right? So the conversation that we're just having right now, with 15 seconds of net audio, which, if you're rambling like I do, takes maybe 30 seconds before you get to that 15 seconds of net audio, because we always have some pauses, right, in our speech, and required easily 60 seconds of net audio in order to create a voice print. Um, so that worked for a handful of organizations, right? The organizations that were willing to make the investment to change their business processes to get to that data. But it was very hard to adapt this to all organizations, especially to organizations that needed to apply this in self-service channels, right? So in a contact center, right in the IVR, um, technology was challenging, at least if you were using the free form speech. And so, Matt, you'll remember a lot of organizations try the active voice biometrics technology that require the individual to speak a specific phrase, and that wasn't the most customer friendly approach to using the tech. And so fast forward to today, where we're using deep neural networks in order to enroll somebody in voice biometrics and validate their identity, we're able to authenticate somebody in easily a fraction of a second or 1 or 2 seconds of net audio, and enroll them with as little as 5 seconds of net audio, which makes the application of this technology in self-service channels viable, and makes the application of this technology at the agent level, right, where there's a live conversation with an agent, so much more efficient. And so that has opened the applications for voice biometrics to beyond just the contact center. And we're starting to see organizations expand it to mobile apps and step-up authentication in the web, and even in brick and mortar locations for in-person verification, which are applications that would have been extremely awkward 10 to 20 years ago with the amount of data that was required.
So I think that's a couple of points to build on there. So first about the duration, and I still get this challenge today really about what happens if we don't have an authentication result by the time the agent needs to do something. And I think from what you're saying, that just shouldn't be an issue anymore. We should always be able to get some form of results before the agent needs to do anything. Is that what you're saying?
That's exactly it. It's lightning fast. In fact, when there's an agent that doesn't get that virtually immediate green light telling them that this is the right individual, then instinctively that agent will know that the person on the line is not the correct person. And so it has become virtually instantaneous, at least to a human, given that responses are typically done within half a second to 1 or 2 seconds of an audio.
Hey Brett, I'm really sorry your audio's clipping again. We're gonna have to do that little you'll have to do that little dance.
Oh god! All
And
right.
I'll entertain people whilst you're doing it. I think some really valid points there. And when Brett comes back on, the two points I want to bring up further are really around tuning and calibration, the amount of time it takes to get these systems up and running. And increasingly, we're seeing that out of the box, these systems are good enough for many applications. Yes, there's still benefit in validating the configurations are well set and all the rest of it. But actually, in many cases, they're good enough to use out of the box. Hey, Brett, you're back. So I was just going to build on two issues. So one, I think, was the tuning and calibration discussion, and this is often that chicken and egg debate. And I think we're in a state now where actually, in many cases, these solutions are good enough to use out of the box, and it's a case of validating the settings more than it is optimizing or configuring them for your particular environment. So, would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. And that has enabled organizations that have no internal expertise in biometrics at all to use this technology and not have to rely on outside experts, such as those that come from organizations like Microsoft, to tune and calibrate biometrics, which is a fine art, and we call them speech scientists. These are individuals that take data, that perform tests, and that then analyze those tests to calibrate biometric engines. And so those individuals are still around. They can still be leveraged to achieve optimal performance. But for the great majority of organizations, the performance that exists out of the box is more than sufficient. And so a lot of mid-sized organizations that have deployed voice biometrics today are using the settings, the biometric settings that exist in the product without any modifications at all. And that is a testament to how mature the system is and how the technology has become. Matt, you'll remember that back in the day, right? So maybe a decade or more ago, using a biometric tool out of the box without any tuning calibration was akin to using a product that was providing virtually random results. And so vendors were very
I think it was probably career suicide.
yeah. So vendors I think were very open and transparent about that, and that's why the use of speech scientists in order to perform that tuning and calibration was mandatory. And so it's no longer a mandatory step. Now it's it's an optional step in order to squeeze out just a little bit more performance out of the algorithms. And as I said, that the ROI on performing that step only makes sense for very large organizations who want to squeeze out maybe an extra percentage point out of the system. Whereas an organization that may be performing hundreds of thousands of verifications per year, it just doesn't make a material difference to perform that step.
Awesome. And I mean that was on my feature request list for probably most of the last decade. So thanks very much for delivering on that. Just on the other point you made about active versus passive, that was something that a lot of people got hung up on maybe 5-6 years ago. We often didn't get off the start line with projects because we were having this debate about should it be active and go in the IVR? Should it be passive and go with the agent? Should we try and do both? Is it too complex to try and do both? Has that debate been finalized? Are we passive all the way, passive everywhere? I think one of your colleagues called it a few months ago.
Yeah, I think there are only a handful of organizations that are still operating as they did originally when they deployed these solutions, that are still using active voice biometrics. But there's no need for active anymore, given the efficacy of passive voice biometrics. So the ability to authenticate somebody with extremely short segments of audio in a very accurate and secure way makes that technology obsolete. So for new customers, for organizations that are looking into this technology for the first time and that are thinking about deploying it, it is indeed, that debate is no longer valid.
Awesome. And here we go with the almost the poison chalice topic of the debate. When we talk about performance, like there's obviously the core biometric performance, and that was a focus for an awful long time. And then there were all these other things that came along with the engine, such as recording and playback, and even synthetic speech detection, which were always kind of something we talked about during implementation and did our risk assessments and determined that actually no one was going to attack it in this way because the technology wasn't valid, the technology wasn't effective, and it just wasn't worth the customer experience cost of doing that. That clearly is no longer the case. And a lot of questions coming up from our audience about what Microsoft and Nuance are doing to keep ahead of that deep fake audio threat, and how should that be considered in the context of performance overall?
Yeah, Matt, you're rightfully so bringing this topic up, because it is on everybody's minds these days. And so I was speaking earlier about the performance enhancements of voice biometrics. That is rooted in enhancements in deep neural networks. And those same foundational technology improvements have also been applied to other technologies, such as the generation of synthetic voices, right? So deep fakes, Matt, as you mentioned them, which is kind of the nefarious use of that technology. Um, and so the good news here is that we've always considered this as a potential threat. So whether a presentation attack used a recording or a synthetic voice, we were always prepared for that type of attack from a technology perspective. Now, most of our customers did not implement these algorithms, because once they performed their risk assessment, they determined that there really was no need for them, given that there was no attacks using synthetic voice, given the immaturity of the technology. About a year and a half ago, there are some vendors that launched their solutions online that allowed the creation of synthetic voices with very little audio input, and that provided a GUI that was quite easy to use. So you didn't need to be a programmer in order to create your synthetic voice. And so that's changed the game. So we saw a lot of media attention on this topic. We saw some journalists synthesizing their own voices to try to get into their own accounts. Um, and fortunately, even for organizations that were running, um, older technology and that had not enabled these protective layers, um, the technology actually performed quite well, given that these journalists were unsuccessful in their initial attempts and had to try again and again and again. And eventually, they were able to get through. But that did create some panic. That did create some panic for sure. And we've been working very hard to reassure customers that they have the tools at their disposal to address this attack. And one of the best ways to stay ahead of the game, so to speak, right, so to stay ahead of the fraudsters, is to leverage a cloud version of the solution. And the reason for that is that the onus on updates and upgrades is on the vendor, right, instead of on an internal IT organization. And so, Matt, I was talking about some customers out there that are still using active voice biometrics that they deployed, maybe 10 years ago. Well, that exposes them to some risk, right? And I want to be very open and transparent. We are not seeing fraudsters use this technology at scale. We've seen a handful of cases where that's been attempted. But in this is a threat that we need to prepare for, and we've been working jointly with organizations to move them to cloud so that they can have the latest and greatest technologies, which are available because our research teams are focused on staying several steps ahead of nefarious individuals. And our in our specific case, right, being part of Microsoft, we have access to the source algorithms. We have access to the source data that feeds the most advanced synthetic voice algorithms out there. So that's, Matt, the most specific answer that I can provide to your question, which is that's how we stay ahead of this threat by developing mitigating technologies before they're even released to the public.
Awesome. Thanks for that. And I liken it almost to the kind of the antivirus days. Like it at no point in time is this going to be a solved problem. Both technologies will continue to evolve. It's about how to kind of reduce the cost and complexity of implementing those patches and changes. And as you suggest, cloud is a way to do that. The threat will continue naturally to evolve, and it's I think you're absolutely right to say that where we've seen attacks, they've mostly been in this kind of colluded reputational risk more than they have been scale fraud. And in fact, our own risk assessment suggests that the biggest vulnerability from deepfake voices is not enterprises deploying voice biometric solutions. It's enterprises who remain on knowledge-based authentication models and whose customers are socially engineered at scale by synthetic voices to hand over those credentials. It's far easier to generate 1,000 phone calls sounding like the person down the street asking you to give them letter 3 and 4 from your password so I can put that in online or into another system than it is to try and create a target specific voice and fool a biometric system. So yes, the threat does exist. It's moved from the kind of theoretical to feasible, but actually in the kind of the overall threat spectrum, it's probably not as high as the current media speculation suggests. Although I do know that it's one of the easy things that people throw out there as a reason not to implement voice biometrics. So what would you say to those people who are kind of faced with their peers and colleagues in the organization who want to implement this technology, but people keep saying, "Oh, what about deepfakes?" What would you say to them?
Yeah, well, one of the consistent responses that we've seen from organizations that have had to deal with this reputational issue, right, that have been the subject of some of these media articles, consistently, those organizations have emphasized that they urge their customers to stay with voice biometrics because that is the most effective way to protect their accounts. And so every technology has vulnerabilities. The vulnerabilities associated with the alternatives, unfortunately, are significantly higher, right? So passwords, pins, security questions, SMS, OTP, there are massive security holes in those technologies. And so for a specific consumer to not use the technology, they're putting their accounts at risk. But then for an organization not to implement this technology, they're putting all of their customers at risk. And so that's the response that I have to organizations that are hesitating because of this threat. And I want to reassure them that this is a threat that is top of mind for us, and that we have a mitigating strategy for. And so it is, Matt. I like your analogy with antivirus. We have the antivirus software to prevent this type of attack. It just needs to be turned on, and that's something that many organizations are doing right now.
Awesome. So I'm sure we'll get back to this in the questions, but I'm gonna move on because we had one other topic area we wanted to pick up on, and that was cost. And to a certain extent, cost is a function of complexity, and I do remember a conversation where it basically like it was $1 million to start a project, and that was just in third-party professional services fees. That was just to acquire the audio and figure out all the bits that needed patching to here and there. And then there was the perpetual licenses, and then there was the what am I going to need at peak volume? How many thousands, millions of thousands of transactions am I going to need to do? And the sticker price was enormous. Now, for some organizations, that made economic and commercial sense because it mitigates a lot of frauds, it significantly improved customer experience, it saved a lot of agent handle time, and it was worth the investment. And many organizations have done it on that basis. But I just don't think that's true anymore. When I look at the technology that's available today, you can kind of switch it on in the console of some of these contact center as a service applications. It's not, and it's a consumption based model. Yep. So it's not about huge upfront costs. I don't know. What does it take to get a solution up and running today, Brett?
Yeah, Matt, I'm glad that you bring that up. And maybe to add one other layer of cost, I've heard from a lot of organizations that went through this legacy deployment model that they had also a lot of internal IT costs. So it wasn't necessarily just the spend
Yeah,
for
good
a
point. Good point.
but I've heard organizations say that the amount of money spent on the vendor was actually the smaller portion of the investment. The internal investment was sometimes a multiple of 2 or 3, right? That spent on the vendor, and that has a lot to do with what we discussed before, right? So Matt, two main things: getting that audio in, getting the data flowing, and then figuring out all the business rules that had to be adapted for this technology. That drove a lot of cost. And so, as we spoke about earlier, that is no longer a requirement. And so we've seen organizations, community banks, credit unions, organizations that have a handful of contact center agents, and I do mean a handful, that have been able to deploy this technology successfully and achieve a return on investment within a year. I had one executive, so contact center executive at one of these community banks, and she shared with me that 3 months after deploying voice biometrics within their contact center, they had prevented one fraudulent attack, which would have resulted in a fraud loss of about $100,000, and that delivered an ROI. So that gives you, without sharing the specifics of how much they spent, right? It does give you a scale of what this can cost for a small organization, and so we're very far away from those figures, Matt, that you had shared earlier. Um, so cloud is one of those drivers. The subscription model, Matt, that you mentioned is one of those factors, right? That's driving down cost. That's eliminating that upfront investment, but also just the ability to use the technology out of the box is game changing. And we see organizations that between the time they agree to move forward with this technology and the time that their customers are benefiting from the technology, is that it can be as quick as 90 days, which, Matt, I think that was completely unfathomable, all right, back in the days where hardware had to be purchased and you could easily wait that length of time just to receive your hardware.
Yeah, I think, yeah, well, yeah, that was definitely true. But I think our rule of thumb was something like 1/3, 2/3 to third party costs versus internal costs, and was 3 years to achieve run rate benefits. So 3 years before you could start banking, you were kind of in positive benefit territory, because it probably took you 12 to 18 months to switch on a service, and then another 12 months to kind of start getting into positive territory in terms of how much it cost you to enroll and all the rest of it. So to positive benefits in 90 days, I won't drink to that because I don't have anything here, but I would definitely drink to that. Awesome. So that's really all we wanted to cover in terms of these kind of 3 big areas. I think it's worth a quick recap on those before we jump into questions. And anyone who's online can drop questions into the various different chat features, and we will pick those up and ask Brett. But I also had 43 separate questions from people, of which about a third were on deepfake. So we'll come to those in a second. Before we do, I think it's worth a quick summary of those kind of 3 big areas we talked about. Complexity, principally about integration and business processes. That it's a solved problem. Yep, that we know how to do this. We know how to plug it into pretty much everything. You don't even necessarily need third-party professional services to do this. Your developers should be able to do this using the instructions out of the box. Complex performance terms, what it takes to get a system up and running and stable and performant, largely available out of the box. Yes, there might be some benefits to fine tuning. And then finally, cost. Cost may not even be an object anymore if you can get to payback in 90 days. What used to take 3 years could now easily be done in 6 months, it sounds like. And I've seen some implementations like that as well. So I would agree with that. We're going to jump into questions then. The one of the big ones we haven't really touched on here because it's kind of outside the technology domain, but it's about privacy and consent. So I think in a similar way, kind of 10, 12 years ago, when we were first implementing this technology, we had to explain to regulators what exactly biometrics were and how they might be used and what they should be worried about them. And we were largely leading the debate. I think in many jurisdictions, it's become certainly clearer what the regulations are and what needs to be done. But in some ways, people also see that as a barrier to adoption and a challenge and a reason why they might not deliver significant benefits or much benefit as they think they might for the organization. Brett, do you think that privacy regulations and obtaining customer consent is a barrier to voice biometric adoption?
I don't, and I think I was quite a lone voice 12, 13 years ago when I was trying to convince organizations that providing notification and collecting consent was a good business practice. Back in the day, as Matt, you mentioned, there were very few jurisdictions that had these requirements, and so we did see organizations that took these best practices that we had communicated back in the day and implemented them, and now they're in a position where they don't need to make modifications to their deployments. But we also saw organizations that were a little bit more aggressive in their approach and decided to not follow that path. And then as regulations evolved, had to change the way that they deployed. And Matt, I think you're aware of some of those cases in the UK where organizations had to, unfortunately, delete some voice prints and then re-enroll individuals, because of that. So all that to say is that no, I don't believe it's a barrier. I think organizations should feel very comfortable with the fact that there is a harmonization of requirements pretty much across the globe, whether you're in Europe, you're in the UK, you're in the United States, you're in Canada, many other countries. Some of the foundational requirements in privacy as to keep your system transparent and open and provide notification that it's in use. And then for the purpose of enrollment, creation of biometric prints, collect consent. And I think one of the reasons why organizations feel that it could potentially slow things down is that probably in the back of their minds, they're thinking that they need to send a 12-page legal document to somebody that needs to take out a pen and sign it and then mail it back to the organization. And that is not the case at all. Regulators have been very flexible. They've understood the need to be able to collect consent and provide notification in the channel that the customer is operating in. And in a phone channel, that means using your voice, So providing an affirmation, saying yes, saying okay, yeah, go ahead, That's all that you really need to be able to showcase that the individual has agreed to this. And in self-service channels, it's even easier. So whether you're in the mobile app or in the IVR, having somebody press the OK button on a touch screen, or verbalizing their affirmation, just saying yes, is very quick, very efficient. And so we have not seen organizations that collect consent have a negative impact on their ROI. The great majority of consumers out there embrace this technology. They see the benefits, they understand the benefits, that this is enhancing the authentication process, but also protecting them and protecting their accounts from fraud. And that's something that is universally sought after. And so, again, long response to your question, but I do not see this as a barrier at all.
I think it's interesting that consent and obtaining. So first off, I completely agree with you. And we did a session with a lawyer a few months ago where we kind of went round this same subject. It's just the right thing to do. It's rude and a bit weird to do this without asking people. It's kind of you just should do it anyway. Whether you have to dress it up in quite as many legal terms is something to debate with your own lawyers, but that will vary by organization. I think some of the challenge though here is that it's seen as an extra cost of implementing this type of authentication and security technology versus others such as SMS OTP or push notifications or device-based authentication. And actually, whilst I agree to some degree, really it's you should also see it as a function of training. Yeah, it helps customers to understand the service they are about to use and makes them better users of it because they feel engaged in the process rather than forced to do something. So I know it can appear like an incremental cost of this compared to other forms of authentication and security, but I'm not sure that's necessarily a fair comparison. And when you do have that consent, the opportunities that creates over those other methods are quite significant. I don't know if you've got anything to add there, Brad.
Yeah, Matt, I do. I do. So enabling a OTP, right? So enabling SMS OTP, that requires an overt step from the customer, right? They need to provide you with their cell phone number. So there is a cost to the consumer and there's a cost to the organization to drive that behavior. Um, and yet you're left with a credential or a step-up authentication method that is at most temporary because people change their phone numbers, people change their devices, and so it is not a lifelong credential. And so one of the beauties of biometrics is that you keep on using this biometric credential for decades. And so once you spread that cost over the lifespan of that credential, the lifespan of that relationship with the customer, then it really becomes completely negligible.
So now I think that leads on to another question that was asked in my call for questions earlier, which was outside banks and financial services who are clear users of this technology, and in my mind it's a matter of time. What other industries and sectors do you see a kind of unrealized return on investment that they could get from implementing this kind of technology?
Yeah. So any organization that is struggling with fraud within their contact center is a clear candidate for this. And so beyond the financial sector, we definitely see telecommunication firms gaining a lot of value out of this technology. And I would say that for the time being, it is an exception that a telecommunication firm is using voice biometrics rather than the rule. And so that is unrealized value at the industry scale, even though there are a handful of telecommunication companies in various countries that have benefited from this for many years now. The other key vertical is insurance companies, and that may be a little bit counterintuitive, but insurance companies tend to have very irregular calling patterns into their contact center. So for many of us, we don't call our insurance company for a long period of time until we have some kind of issue. And then there may be several calls in a row as we try to resolve this issue. And so we found that just on the authentication front, the insurance space is an industry where we have a handful of organizations that have realized the value, but where the majority of organizations in this space have not done that yet. And then, maybe another example is government services. And this really came to the forefront during the pandemic, where there were a lot of payments that were going out to citizens from various government agencies. And what came to the fore is that not having a proper way of validating identities is hugely problematic and can lead to a lot of fraud. And what we've seen as organizations across the world, so whether it's the US government, Canadian government, many European governments have lost an incredible amount of money as payments were sent out to individuals that were not in need of these payments, or were outright taking over other individuals' identities in order to receive those payments. So those are just a few examples of organizations that could benefit from voice biometrics. And my response was very much tailored to the contact center space. Once you zoom out and you look at the use of this technology within digital channels, such as mobile apps and the website, it really can apply to any organization that needs step-up authentication, which is a lot, right? I could go down
Okay.
for several minutes, right, just listing all of the
Well,
organizations.
we are coming up on time, so I'm probably gonna have to draw a line.
Sure, 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 sure.
Draw a line there. I'm sure you could sell this to anyone. Uh, but I think I like those three kind of sectors that you talk about, and I would agree those in terms of unrealized opportunities: telcos, insurance, and public services, government services, as you say. Final question then, as we're wrapping up, and I apologize we haven't managed to get to everyone's questions. We've been talking a bit about what was true 10 years ago, what's true now, and what's changed. If you could gaze into your crystal ball, or maybe you have a privileged insight that I don't, what does this technology and its application look like in 10 years? What are the final hurdles, the barriers you will have changed, or you hope to be able to have changed and transformed in that time?
Yeah, well, I have to be very careful what I say.
Yes.
I do have access to some privileged information uh, in my role, but I will say the following on the fraud side, on the fraud prevention side. I do see technologies such as ChatGPT assisting with the task of hunting for fraud and identifying fraudsters and just going through case management. Right now, it's a very manual process, and some organizations have done a phenomenal job, but some organizations don't necessarily have the staff to do that work. And so I do see technologies such as ChatGPT augmenting that side of things. And then specifically on the authentication side, I just see continuous improvement in the technology. And so I see it just becoming even more seamless and transparent, and which will just make the technology more ubiquitous than it is today.
That's a very succinct answer as we're coming up to time. So thank you very much for that, Brett. And I'm sorry we didn't get to everyone's questions who came up on who answered. I think we covered most of the general topic areas, but I will have a look at those and see if we can come up with some offline answers for people. So thank you very much for joining us, Brett, and contributing to today's session. Thank you everyone who joined online, on LinkedIn, on YouTube, and wherever else this is being broadcast. Thank you very much for joining the modern security community. As you can see, we're here really to talk about the application of this technology so it can improve customers' security and the efficiency and usability of call and contact center processes. In our next session, which is scheduled for just checking my calendar, for the 9th of November, it's just me, I'm afraid, but I will be digging into the return on investment for modern security technologies as a whole, not just voice biometrics, really looking at what the cost of poor security and poor authentication processes in today's contact centers and call centers are. And we'll be using some tools from aforementioned book, including some new tools that we'll be deploying on the day. So thank you very much for joining us. I hope you can join us on the 9th of November. You'll receive a recording afterwards. And once again, Brett, thank you very much.
Thanks, Matt.